So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Mike Joseph, who's sitting at the table there. He first got in touch with the German Society last year, asking for some input to his project. And by May, we were able to send him a list of obliging native German speakers who were happy to do voiceovers for recordings in English. Some of them, I think, are here tonight, and you'll be able to see some of them on one of Mike's slides. Mike Joseph is a current affairs broadcaster. His programme credits include World in Action, Weekend World, and the 100-Year House for the BBC. His current production is Keys, A Troubled Inheritance, uncovering the conflicted histories in his family inheritance, and he's going to talk to us about the project. He's been greatly assisted by his daughter Asha, who will also be helping with the presentation this evening. She's a bit hidden behind the laptop there, but she is here. So please welcome Mike Joseph. Thank you.
Lisa, thank you for that very kind welcome, and indeed thank you and the Bath German Society and Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution for the invitation to speak this evening. It's an important evening for this project. This is the first time that the project, even though the project itself has been going for more years than I care to remember, it's the first time that I've spoken about it in public and to an audience who are here, and I'm sure all of you are here, not for any casual reason, but because you have a very particular interest either in the theme or issues to do with the theme or the production and what have you. So this is a milestone for a project that has its genesis probably in the 1990s, if not earlier. And another reason I'm particularly glad to be here this evening is because of the nature and history of this institution. The Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution is about many things and has been responsible for many advances in knowledge and understanding over the years. And all of that depends on the asking of questions. And as you will hear this evening, although I'm here to tell you a story, what I'm really here to do is ask questions and not give answers, because I assure you this story throws up many more questions than answers. The answers aren't for me to find, they're for you to find. So before I go further and introduce myself, who I am, and how I got into this story, I must just say a particular thank you to my daughter Asha, who's already been introduced to you. You'll see her quietly managing the audiovisual side of the talk this evening. And she's not only the technical director this evening, she's also very much part of the telling of this story. Because again, if this story is about anything, it's about inheritance. It's about the passing on. It's about the way that all of us are our particular generation in our families. We all inherit a story and we all pass a story on. So this is very much part of that process of passing on. Normally, the passing on of stories happens in family in the privacy of your own sitting room. On this occasion, it's in the public domain, but nevertheless, it's still a handing on and a handing down. So probably the best way to introduce myself is by playing for you the opening sequence of the first episode of my new series, and the first episode which will go live this autumn, and you will all of you be advised and told when that is available to hear. So here's how it goes.
No one gets to choose their parents. We all inherit a story, like it or not. But we can choose what to do with that story. I'm Mike Joseph. The story my parents gave me was full of life and loss, wars, genocide, and ethnic cleansing. What should I do with that legacy? What would you do? I was 50 before I did anything at all. Welcome to Keys, A Troubled Inheritance. I'm a journalist and historian. I've published and spoken about the Holocaust and how earlier genocides of the Herero and Armenian peoples informed both the perpetrators and the victims of the Holocaust. But here is a story about my own family and my years of investigating what was done to them and what they did. It is the most compelling story I've ever worked on, but should I even be doing it? Is it right to explore painful family memories in public? And if that breaks rules, here's some more rule breaking. My story brings together the Holocaust and the Palestinian Nakba. That tests the boundaries of what is permitted to be said these days. Can you do justice to the enormity of the Holocaust and also the fact that it was survivors of the Holocaust who created new victims in Palestine? No surprise that there have been attempts to suppress this story. So, to justify this narrative, maybe it's not enough just to reveal the truth. Perhaps it also needs the inevitability of inheritance, a family inheritance.
There are so many ways to tell this story, and the way I'm going to start this evening is with this picture of my mother, Lily, on a tray. I'm really fortunate to have this picture, as we'll be hearing the chaos and the crises in my mother's family history are very well documented in over a century of family letters, official records, humble receipts, and even in old family recordings. In some ways, this story was already made for audio, but to have a photo of a moment of crisis is very rare. The place of this photo is Leipzig's Hauptbahnhof. If you've been to Leipzig, you will know that that is one of the most astonishing railway stations in the world. It's in the heart of the city. The year of this photo is 1939. The photographer is Lily's father, Israel Gold, my grandfather. They are parting, and they don't know for how long. 30 years ago, my mother recorded her memories of this moment and of many others. I followed that up by recording my aunt's memories, sometimes similar, sometimes rather strangely different. After that, I set out on wider research trips across Europe and the Middle East, meeting and recording the words of friends of their family, supporters, colleagues, and adversaries, lethal adversaries. So when I started producing this documentary series, the story was already partly told in the words of many witnesses. But of course, that left a problem. What about words and testimony that had not been recorded in sound? My mother wrote some of her evidence. Not everything was recorded. Her father, my grandfather Israel Gold, was a prolific letter writer. He never got on a train without writing a letter. The Nazi who stole my mother's house was too deaf to record an interview when I tracked him down, but I noted down his words. You can see them scribbled there in between the questions to the Nazi. Well, the Nazi who killed my mother's family died a few years before I caught up with him. But I met his mistress, his son, survivors of his violence across Europe from Ukraine to France, some of whom tried to assassinate him, and also those who tried and convicted him. Some of these meetings I did record, but most have left their record in hasty notes in my reporter's notebook. There's an example on screen. So that's why a year ago, this very week, I wrote to Philippa Harrington of Bath German Society, and I told her, here I am seeking native German speakers to voice up dialogue for my audio podcast. Could she suggest any possible names? I pushed my luck further, and this is what I wrote. I would prefer to have voices that sound like native German speakers. Even better would be Saxon accents. Sechsel in Bath, warum nicht? The response was wonderful. About 10 names came forward straight away. Native German speakers in Bath. Who believed it? And the production was underway. So, to Philippa, to Lisa, and all the members of Bath German Society, my really warm thanks and gratitude. Although, for some reason, while there are no Sächsische Sprecher in Bath, there seem to be many Austrians. Who knows? Anyway, let's hear just some of these voices, how they sound. alongside the actual words of people themselves. Here, to begin, are George May of Bath as Israel Gold, my grandfather, and then the actual voices of my mother Lily Gold and my aunt Rosa.
How are relations with the Arabs? Try getting along in peace and friendship. It's likely to be important. It would be fine to communicate and to live in peace together with this similar race of people in future.
We were absolutely stunned and terrified. Pitch dark, and people were driven there like wild animals, with SS on both sides, with sticks and guns.
To see him being insulted like that and maltreated, that was something absolutely terrible to me. From that time on, he really suffered.
Now to Ukraine, to hear Rabbi Moshe Kolesnik, leader of the Jewish community in Ivano-Frankivsk, then Henrik Luft, visiting Ukraine from Israel, and we are all assisted by Svetlana Kovalik, my Ukrainian interpreter.
Значит, расстрелы начались, люди стояли вот где мы сейчас стоим, евреи стояли.
There were 3 big pits dug.
They took my grandmother. I was hiding. Thousands of people were walked here. I know that nobody came back.
You know why I remember? I was reading Luft, and then it's she. I thought, goodness, it was she. And now you tell me it comes back to my mind.
Looking back on the Second World War and the Holocaust, Vera Hobhouse from Bath, voicing family friend Marie Nummer, Terry Dimmock from Wales, voicing a car park attendant, and then the troubled voice of SS killer Hans Krüger's son.
Your dear parents will probably no longer be alive. Your dear good mother, whom I shall never forget as long as I live.
No way could they say they had to do that. Only obeying orders. You don't obey orders like that.
I know I am the son of Hans Krüger. Like told me, biological.
3 Bath voices bring to life Leipzig and German politicians struggling to make sense of unification in the 1990s. Clemens Hofer, Klaus Riekemann and Bruno Bubno-Kastlitz, followed by James Stewart from Wales as the Queen's private secretary.
I can find no justification in the law for treating Jewish property differently. We should therefore fully exploit the loophole which Section 3A offers us to speed up investment.
The principle of restitution before compensation is a dead end for Leipzig.
We do not expect our partners abroad to accept such positions.
Her Majesty was grateful to you for writing to her and read your letter with much sympathy. I have sent your letter to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office.
Practical denazification in 1991, voiced by Kerstin Bartelmes from Wales, Christel Stöcker-Danby from Bath, and Werner Bauer from Cottbus, Germany, who plays Herr Sonderführer Ralph Dippmann, and finally, my daughter Asha from Wales.
But you must find the 1943 purchase contract. Perhaps it will show something like, for services to the Reich.
Dippmann can have his house back to manage at any time. His ownership is clear. Now, if you don't mind, I have many people waiting to see me.
Wir sind hier in Deutschland. Man braucht keinen Rechtsanwalt. Hier muss sich sogar der Kaiser von China dran halten.
The one question is, what do you say to an old Nazi?
What do you say?
Finally, to Israel-Palestine. My cousin Yehuda describes what my uncle Baruch did in 1948. Then Itamar Shapira, the Yad Vashem guide, who refused to be silent about 1948. And then Andrea Brondino from Wales and Italy voices Henrik Luft, who we have already heard in his own voice, but who would not let me record some things that he shared with me.
It was 1948, yes, and he was part of the 8th Brigade from the Permach.
70 years ago, people killed Jews and no one cared, and not care about what is happening now. If I can speak up against this, I shouldn't be speaking at all.
If it's against your conscience, it's tough. If you criticize, you're called anti-Semitic. It's blackmail, ridiculous.
So, thanks to all these and more voices still, The full audio series, Keys and Troubled Inheritance, will be launched this autumn. And 2 years in particular stand out in today's fragment of that journey, 1941 and 1948. We start in 1941. Ukraine has just been invaded, and refugees are fleeing wherever they can, including to Reading, not so very far from here in Bath. In Reading in 1941, Edith Morley has recently retired as Professor of English at the university. She is not just a professor, but the first British woman in history to be awarded a professorship. Now, as Emeritus Professor Morley, she is fully occupied for the second time in her life, supporting wartime refugees. In the First World War, it was Belgians fleeing the German invasion of Belgium. And now in the Second World War, it's Jews fleeing the Germans everywhere. Edith Morley knows German well. In her teens, she completed her secondary education through the medium of German in Hanover. As a socialist, a Fabian, a feminist, and a suffragette, she would certainly have been interested in a young German Jewish woman who had won a place to study medicine at the University of Bologna, prevented by Mussolini from taking that up, and instead now seeking refuge from the Nazis in Reading. Separated from her family, who were unable to get British visas to escape, penniless, driven out of London by the Blitz, and desperate for news of her family in occupied Ukraine, Lily Gold had just been offered a lifeline to train as an accountant. But would government immigration rules prevent that? Professor Morley was an old hand at challenging authority. So, on September the 3rd, 1941, she wrote,
September 3rd, 1941. Miss Lily Gold, a Polish refugee from Nazi oppression, has been...
I must interrupt to explain something. My mother Lily had a Polish passport, but she was born and raised in Germany, in the city of Leipzig. She knew no other home. Until October 1938, she'd never been in Poland, spoke no word of Polish. But Germany had refused to naturalize her father, Israel Gold, even though he was decorated fighting for Germany in the First World War. He had grown up in the Austrian province of Galicia, the heartland of Western Ukraine. After the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in 1918, Ukraine and Poland fought for control of Galicia. Now, this is the Gold family's official Familienkarte, something that may be more familiar in Germany than in the UK. There's an extraordinary amount of family history recorded just in this one frame. We'll look at some of that now. In that Polish-Ukrainian war, at first Ukraine prevailed. And though Israel Gold had been Austro-Hungarian living in Leipzig, he became Ukrainian. You can see the UKR, we'll see it closer in a moment. That might have ended well. Unlike the newly reborn state of Poland, where ethnic nationalism dominated politics, Western Ukraine's model of nationalism was civic, not ethnic. Minority rights were guaranteed, and the Polish, Jewish, and German communities were represented in government. But in 1921, the victorious Western nations decided that Poland had the stronger case to take Galicia and would be a better ally in the confrontation with Bolshevism. Ukraine was partitioned, and Israel Gold, now married and working in Leipzig, Germany, with a one-year-old daughter, Lily, received a Polish passport. Let's take a closer look, and there you can see all those changes recorded with bureaucratic precision. An OH, presumably Österreichisches, Ungarisches, crossed out, then the Ukrainisch, and finally Polnish. In October 1938, Nazi Germany suddenly expelled all Jews with Polish passports to Poland. They were easy enough to pick out from the large J stamped on each Familienkarte. My mother and her family became refugees in eastern Poland, in Israel Gold's childhood home. That place, you're going to have to remember this, it was called Stanisław in German, Stanisławiv in Ukrainian, Stanisławów in Polish, and today, none of those, it's called Ivano-Frankivsk. It's the same place, and it's one of the bloodiest in 20th century Europe. I will try to use the name most appropriate to each stage of this story. In 1939, Lily and one sister Rose escaped Stanislavov to Britain, leaving behind 46 close family and cousins.
September 3rd, 1941. Miss Lily Gold, a Polish refugee from Nazi oppression, has been registered with my committee ever since she came to Reading, and I can vouch for her antipathy to the Nazi regime and to her loyalty to the Allied cause. Miss Gold, who is 21 years of age, is an educated, well-bred young woman. She is well suited to the profession of chartered accountant, and I hope will be given the exemption for which she asks. Edith J. Morley, Emeritus Professor, University of Reading, Honorary Secretary, Reading and District Refugee Committee.
So we know what Professor Morley was thinking, and we also know what Lily Gold was thinking in that summer of 1941. Here she is now, remembering that bitter day in a high summer, in a recording that she made 50 years later. This is from episode 1 again.
Parting from my parents, there was still some hope that we would meet again. But, it was such a long, drawn-out period of worry and uncertainty and not knowing, you see. The pain just went on and on and on. And one had to cope with everyday life and try and survive all day long. And then in between you would suddenly think, oh, yeah, what are they doing? Where are they? How are they?
Lily was a refugee in the Blitz in London. Her family were refugees in what was Poland, when in 1938 they were expelled from Germany. But with the outbreak of war in 1939, it became the Soviet Socialist Republic of Ukraine. For the moment, they were safe from the Nazis. Lily and her family even managed to send and receive some precious letters. How long would that last? Right now, as I speak these words, we're waiting to hear if Ukraine is about to be invaded. That's what Lily was doing in 1941.
It was one summer morning, it was, I think, in June 1941. I heard it on the radio in the morning, just as I was going out to go to work. And I walked down that street. It was a beautiful street on a hill overlooking the Thames and Reading in the distance, and high trees on both sides. And I was going down the hill towards the office, the street where the office was. And I was absolutely reeling with shock, because I knew that this was going to be the end of them. Once the Germans had attacked there, I knew that that was the end.
No more letters, no more news. Nazi Germany overran Ukraine, unleashing genocide from Estonia to Greece, France to Ukraine. Lily was on her own.
Time moves continually on, even while we try to pin it down to grasp its meaning. When I produced that sequence only 3 months ago, we could still feel that our European world was a post-war world. How wrong we were. We were pre-war, and now no one knows where it will end. So much has already changed, and even this one story of a family inheritance of war, genocide and ethnic cleansing, which I've been working on for nearly 30 years, changes. Only a few weeks ago, I realized that my own mother was born Ukrainian. That's how telling the story changes the story. After the war, Lily told and retold her story to many listeners, not all of them sympathetic. I inherited her precious letters from her parents and family in Ukraine, and also, less appealingly, a huge file of post-war legal correspondence, documenting in grisly detail how for 50 years she fought Germany for any scrap of justice. Compensation, restitution, mostly without success. East Germany washed its hands of any responsibility for the genocide and plunder of the preceding Nazi regime. West German compensation law did admit some claims, such as for the death of a father. Claims were scrutinized by a compensation court in Hildesheim, near Hanover. The claim for the loss of her dear father must have been deeply unpleasant for Lily to pursue. But then what should a state do when it admits liability for mass murder? Life can never be restored. What does money mean? And anyway, how much is a father worth? The whole matter was sordid. In October 1960, Lily heard from her lawyer.
The court in Hildesheim demands the date of last news from your parents, so it can be proven they were still living after 1st September 1939.
That's the day the Second World War started.
October 24th, 1960. I enclosed the last communication I received from my father, dated March 1941. I trust this will do.
Dearest children, we wait in agonies for some news from you and whether you're well. When shall we see you again, fit and well? Untold times in a day do we look at your dear picture. If we only knew you are out of danger. With us everything is well. We are not in need. Wolfgang goes to his music classes very eagerly and with great success. And Dorla is at school, very outstanding and a very sweet girl. Mama is always very overworked, in demand, and I as well. Remain fit and well and happy. My dear children, many kisses from all of us. Your father. I write so few lines and have so much to ask and to tell you.
I have not sent this postcard to Hildesheim as I have legal reservations. Hildesheim wants confirmation that your parents were still living after 1st September 1939, because then it may be presumed that they were killed during the German occupation. But this postcard bears a Russian stamp and gives its place of origin a town which had been under Russian administration for some time. This opens the possibility that they might have died under Russian administration. In such a case, the German authorities are not legally liable. Please let me know if any other news arrived after this postcard of 26th March 1941.
My sister found she had the enclosed card, dated September 5th, 1941, and clearly written under the German occupation. Surely the Hildesheim court must be aware that direct communication between us became impossible once Stanislaw was occupied by the Germans. It was pure chance that the enclosed card reached us.
That must have been enough for the court in Germany to reach a verdict.
It is established that Israel Gold suffered persecution on the basis of his race. Compensation for damage to the personal liberty of Israel Gold is granted in the sum of 9,750 marks.
But the court rejected the claim for compensation for damage to life. Why?
The court deems the date of death to be 8th May 1945, the end of the war, because evidence for an earlier date is not available. As the surviving sisters were 25 and 23 by May 1945, they were adults and not entitled to compensation for loss of father.
This legal device was fake history. The Gold family were persecuted not from September 1939, but from January 1933, as the Nazis came to power, and very soon the boycott of all Jewish enterprise. Lily was then 13 and Rose 11, children. In 1935, they were stripped of all legal rights, and then in 1938 expelled violently from Germany. By May 1945, the date the court set, most Jews killed by Nazi Germany were long dead. But that history was inconvenient for the court in Hildesheim. A year later, in 1962, another West German court opened the trial of Hauptsturmführer Hans Krüger for mass murder perpetrated in Stanislaw in 1941, killing 127,000 Jews. My mother's family were there in Stanislaw. Or were they? When Lily Gold walked down Caversham Hill in June 1941, reeling with shock, she knew that it was the end for her family. But that was all she knew. To the end of her life, she did not know how they had died, where, when, if any had escaped, survived in hiding, resisted, joined the partisans, anything. Above all, she did not know who had done this thing. So, when I decided to take on this task to discover the deed and its perpetrator, I first had to deal with a difficult fact. That card from Lily's father that seemed to persuade the Hildesheim court to award Lily and Rose 9,750 marks, where was it? I searched my mother's precious collection of family letters. There was no trace of any card from September 1941, nothing after March 1941. And that made a serious difference because Hitler's Wehrmacht, the SS, and Hauptsturmführer Hans Krüger had invaded Western Ukraine 3 months later, in June 1941. The Hildesheim court had planted a seed of doubt. So I asked the court. All their papers, they said, were long since deposited in the Niedersächsischen Hauptstaatsarchiv, Hanover, the land archives in Hanover. I went to Hanover, ordered the file marked Lily Gold versus the Federal Republic of Germany, and there it was, Israel Gold's last card. There, on the bottom right, you'll see the Nazi crest. It's stamped Generalgouvernement, Germany's replacement for Poland. That American address, Pearl Harbor, of course, didn't bring America into the war until December 1941. In September, there was still post between the US and the expanding German Reich. William Lavach was a great-uncle of Lily's, and here are Israel Gold's words.
Dear Uncle and Aunt, we received your card of the 10th of August and were very glad to hear that you, as well as Lily and Rosal, are well. Thank you very much for writing, and our best wishes belatedly in respect of both weddings. We are all well, thank God, as you will please inform Lily and Rosal. Please write to us often and in detail about Lily and Rose. It is impossible to describe how much we miss our children.
It was time to go to Hans Krüger's killing fields.
I've dreamt of them many times and imagined all kinds of things whenever I hear about the atrocities that were done. I think, oh God, was it them? The events in Eastern Europe, when the Nazis first came in, how they took people and murdered them wholesale. And I've never found out what happened to my family, so you can imagine what thoughts go through your mind.
This is the field of Lily's worst fears. October the 12th, 1941, was celebrated by the Nazi SS as Stanislauer Blutsonntag, Stanislavov Bloody Sunday. On this day, in this field, they started the murder of the entire Jewish population of the Ukrainian city of Stanislavov. The day started with 20,000 Jews driven out of their homes, that's 2/3 of the Jewish community, marched through the city to this cemetery field.
It was October 1941. They took my grandmother. We lived then on Batorego. They took my grandmother. I remember how they walked them on Batorego Street going here.
65 years to the day, I'm at this field, and so is Henrik Luft, 11 years old when he survived the massacre that killed my mother's family.
I was hiding. Thousands of people were walked here. I know that nobody came back.
Значит, расстрелы начались, люди стояли вот где мы сейчас стоим, евреи стояли.
There were 3 big pits dug, and the people were brought to the brinks of these pits at this very place where we are now standing. The machine gunners, they shot, and the people were just falling into the pits. The shooting lasted from morning till the very evening.
Я не могу этого знать. Я знаю, что Ганс Крюгер и Мах Шмой.
Krüger was the organizer of this action.
Through my interpreter, Svetlana, the rabbi describes this day in 1941 when Hans Krüger, the SS captain with an ordinary name and an extraordinary 8-year career of mass murder, led a few German policemen and many more local helpers to launch the Holocaust in this region. By nightfall, 12,000 people were machine-gunned into the pits, which continued to heave with the bodies of those not yet dead. The rest were released, some to be crushed at the narrow cemetery gates, others to return to homes already seized by Poles and Ukrainians.
And there were 2,000 Ukrainian police. There was a lot of screaming. People want to live. So for the killers, it was they were enjoying. It was an enjoyment. They were merrymaking.
That day was only the start. Hans Krüger continued to massacre a further 100,000 people. It really is impossible to grasp that was the work of one SS captain. And yet soon his rule over life and death in Stanislau was superseded by machine killing at Galicia's extermination camp. You may not have heard of Belzec, where over 500,000 were killed. That death toll was exceeded only by Treblinka and Auschwitz itself. The fact that Belzec is little known tallies with the Nazi mission to destroy life and memory. And here's the significance for this story. Henrik Luft not only survived Krüger's massacres, he also survived Belzec. His escape has the quality of a parable, and you will hear it in my audio series. After Henrik somehow escaped Europe, he reached Palestine to fight in Israel's 1948 War of Independence. After this first meeting on the cemetery field, Henrik and I talked for 4 days. I was startled how untroubled he seemed by these killing fields. It could be maybe because he was an old soldier. On the other hand, something was clearly troubling him. What was it? On the 4th day, he finally opened up. He talked of Israel's lightning victory over the Arab states in 1967 Six-Day War. Israel now occupied huge new territories, including the whole of Palestine.
1967 was a military victory, but a strategic defeat. It turned us into occupiers, and the occupation has brutalized us. It burdens Israel with the territories, the occupation, and the zealots. They are fanatics, not patriots.
One day, if an Israeli government makes a peace deal, those who want to keep the occupied territories will have to give way.
No political party will withdraw from occupied Golan or remove the Jewish settlements in the West Bank.
Israel dismantled the Gaza settlements in 2005.
The Gaza settlements were insupportable. Outrageous luxury, swimming pools amongst poverty. 4,000 of the 8,000 settlers were on the government payroll. And in the West Bank, settlers cut down olive trees and poisoned the wells. So Palestinians can't live.
You've been telling me about 1948, about how you were a young soldier in Israel's War of Independence. You led the storming of a key Egyptian fort when 7 previous attacks had all failed.
Yes, I've done my bit. Now I speak my mind. No one listens. Fuck them.
What should British Jews do who don't like the occupation?
If it's against your conscience, it's tough. If you criticize, you're called anti-Semitic. It's blackmail, ridiculous.
Why don't you speak out? You'd be heard with respect.
I will not speak. There is no point. I won't be here to see disaster.
And your children?
I tell them to leave. There is no hope.
This was very different from what I expected to hear from a survivor of Hans Krüger's massacre and a veteran of Israel's War of Independence. What should I do with this encounter? Did Henrik Luft's bitter criticism and his pessimism even belong in my inherited family story?
So here is the first challenge to what began as a mainstream story of the Holocaust. Henrik Luft's testimony made me question, does Israel's occupation of Palestine also have to concern me as a historian of my family? The answer became clear when I learnt of my uncle's soldiering in 1948. I will return to that, but before we leave Hans Krüger's killing fields, there's another problem in this narrative which you may already have noticed.
And there were 2,000 Ukrainian police. There was a lot of screaming. People want to live. So for the killers, it was they were enjoying. It was an enjoyment. They were merrymaking.
Hans Kruger could not have achieved this scale of slaughter without the organized involvement of local militia, Ukrainian militia. But is this the right time to explore such a history? Putin's claim to be invading Ukraine to denazify it relies on talking up the purported threat to Russia, just as his foreign minister Lavrov did so recently. What did he say? So what if Zelensky is Jewish, he said. The fact does not negate the Nazi elements in Ukraine. We in the West hear such claims as, putting it politely, counterfactual, and an outrageous abuse of history, but they resonate in Russia. Do you remember hearing that short clip from a Cardiff car park attendant earlier on? Here's some more of that encounter. Can I have all afternoon, please?
What a marvellous photo.
Yes, it is.
German?
Austrian. That's my grandfather on the right, just after he enlisted in the Austro-Hungarian army. And on the left, that's his father. They both joined up in the first year of the war, the First World War. And that's when they had this photo taken. And my grandfather, Israel Gold, he was decorated and then murdered in the Second World War.
My father was a small man, but he went into Belsen with his regiment. They shot every German soldier they could lay their hands on. Pray God we don't get another like that Hitler.
We are 3 generations after that World War. But the British Army's liberation of Belsen concentration camp is still a defining Holocaust memory for us. Dachau concentration camp has a similar place in American culture. Soviet Red Army soldiers, many of them Ukrainian, liberated the extermination camps in the east, Belzec, Treblinka, Auschwitz. Few victims survived to be liberated. The Red Army also encountered witnesses and survivors of the Holocaust by bullets, of which Hans Kruger was a prime perpetrator. Here is the Soviet 1944 Act. It's a formal declaration that Hans Kruger, with German and Ukrainian helpers, led the slaughter in Stanislaviev of 127,352 Jews. I found this document in 1999 in the Ivano-Frankivsk archives. It names the leading perpetrators, and amongst them you can see the chief of Ukrainian police, Colonel Banach. The Soviet encounter with the Nazi killing regime in 1944-45 was bound to have lasting impact on Russian society. However, the state would in future distort, simplify, suppress, and exploit its memory. But the war in Ukraine was not simple, and it certainly wasn't a straight contest of good versus evil. It was just as much a Ukrainian civil war as a world war. In Ivano-Frankivsk, I met Valentin Verbovi from another side of that civil war. My interpreter, Alex Dunai, speaks first.
There is a terrible bandit, a beast, not a person, Hans Kruger, who kills everybody, and who is just the most cruel person.
За цього Ганса Крігера націоналісти розстріляли.
That Ukrainian nationalists here from the Ukrainian rebel army, they were trying to chase him. They were making several attempts to murder him, to kill him, but it was very hard. He was guarded very properly, so it was not easy. Nobody knew where he was located, in his villa or in the prison.
I am sorry that you didn't manage to catch Hans Kruger and kill him, but I'm very happy that you tried.
Шкода, що не зловили Ганса Крюгера, але добре, що пробували, хоча б принаймні.
Пробували, але то неможливо було. Він, по-перше...
The letters that Lily received from her father and family from 1939 to 41 were precious to her, and they were my key to unlocking the story. We heard earlier how one letter was vital in establishing whether her family were killed by the Soviets or the Nazis. Here is another from Israel Gold, dated March the 25th, 1940.
Dear Lily, don't be worried about us. We have enough good food in our good flat, and I have a pleasant job as an accountant at a big library. The winter was extremely long and severe from the second half of December till this week, without any interruption. We have enough fuel, so we are not cold. Hopefully we'll get your photos soon. Mama is just saying I should write, Lily, take care that your cheeks are not too thin. You will make a bad photograph. Lily, I kiss you warmly. Your Pa.
An accountant at a big library in 1940. When the Soviet Union established its rule in Stanislavov in 1939, a new library would be part of the new Soviet order. This was a clue I had to follow. I asked my interpreter, Alex Dunai, to call today's library in Ivano-Frankivsk. He comes off the phone and tells me what they said.
Of course, first of all, the library was established in 1940, in May 1940. His name was Pashnetsky. He has become director of this library from January 1940.
Stop you there. January the 19th.
January the 19th, 1940.
Because we know that my grandfather became the chief accountant at a big library sometime between January the 6th and January the 23rd.
She has got the copy of this record, this file, on director of the library from his daughter.
His daughter is still here in the town?
Yes. Yes.
So therefore we should go and see the daughter to see if she remembers anything about the people her father appointed.
Yes, we can do this, but yes, we can do this, sure. Алло, Марія Іллінічна? Вибачте, то знову вас я турбую, Олександр Дунай. Скажіть, будь ласка, зараз чи можна було взагалі зустрітися з вами і з донькою Пашницького? Дякую дуже. Школа номер 13. 13. І як її звати? Іда Васильівна. His daughter is teacher of German at school number 13.
She'll be in the classroom this morning.
То і так? Ясно. Дуже вам дякую. Дякую. Всього доброго. До побачення. Okay, so now we've got Ida Pashnitska. She is daughter of the first director of the library.
And she's a German teacher.
Teacher of German, yes.
We need to go there. Should we phone the school first or just turn up?
I think we'll just go there.
A school sounds like a school anywhere in the world.
Oh, yes. Exactly. Will you continue, or would you like me to tell about your grandfather?
I am a journalist. I'm with the BBC, but the reason that I'm here and the reason that I want to talk with her today, and I'm very pleased to meet her, is that my grandfather worked, I think, in the same library as her father.
Наскільки ми знаємо з листів його діда, діда його звали Israel Gold.
How old was she when the library was established?
Скільки, якщо можна, скільки, ви зрозуміли, ви німецьку знаєте, скільки вам було років, коли була та бібліотека організована?
Зараз я розкажу. Мені взагалі не було ні скільки років. Я народилася у 41-му році, після смерті батька.
She was born in 1941, after the death of her father.
Так, настільки я цю історію знаю з розповідей і маю з цих.
But first, please, would you ask, how did her father die?
How did her father die? Скажіть, а як сталося, що ваш батько загинув?
Зараз розкажу.
Може, почнемо з того, якщо можна.
З самого початку,
бо
тут, власне, воно стосується з бібліотекою зв'язано, його смерті.
Так?
Так.
So he will tell from the very beginning, because his death was connected with the history of library.
Я маю вдома теж це друковане, я б могла навіть вам дати, але ж.
The library killed her father. He was murdered by the Soviet state for the exact same reason that Ukrainians are being killed today, for being a Ukrainian who wanted to be Ukrainian. If that is not sufficient reason to tell in my audio series how and why Ida Pashnitska's father was killed, I have yet another reason. In January 1940, Vasyl Pashnitsky rescued my grandfather and his family from destitution. One family amongst thousands of displaced Jewish refugees in Stanislavov. He gave Israel Gold employment and income, companionship, security, and hope in desperate times. And even though Captain Hans Krüger killed my family less than 2 years later, the shocking fact is that Israel Gold outlived his last colleague, Vasyl Pashnitsky. On June the 22nd, 1941, as the Nazis invaded Soviet Ukraine, as Lily Gold walked down Caversham Hill, reeling with shock, as Hans Krüger arrived in Lviv to start murdering, Vasyl Pashnitsky was killed by Stalin's NKVD as they fled the advancing Germans.
Liberated by the German army from the Bolshevik yoke, we felt a certain relief. Gradually, the German government instituted a regime of truly unbelievable terror and corruption, so that now everybody agrees that the German regime is perhaps even more evil and diabolic than the Bolshevik regime.
If there is one Ukrainian who embodies the contradictions of this history, it may be Andrei Sheptytsky. Bishop Sheptytsky was head of the Greek Catholic Church in Lviv, and this is his letter to the Pope in Rome in August 1942, followed by his November 1942 pastoral letter to be read in all churches.
The Jews are the primary victims. The number of Jews killed in our region has certainly surpassed 200,000. Almost 130,000 men, women and children were executed in Kiev within a few days. Those who do not look upon political murder as a sin entertain a peculiar kind of self-delusion, as if politics freed men from the obligation to observe divine law and justified a crime that is contrary to human nature. This is not the case. A person who sheds the innocent blood of his enemy, of his political opponent, is just as much a murderer as one who does it for robbery, and is just as deserving of God's punishment and the condemnation of the Church.
When the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed in 1918, Andrei Sheptytsky helped create the short-lived West Ukrainian People's Republic, a model of inclusive civic nationalism, guaranteeing political rights for Poles, Jews and Germans. Israel Gold had been one of its citizens. He held its passport. Perhaps 20 years later, that had entitled him, a bourgeois Jewish refugee expelled from Germany, to have state employment in Soviet Ukraine. Under the Nazi occupation, Sheptytsky personally sheltered Jews and instructed his clergy to do likewise, and wrote in protest to Himmler and Hitler. Yet, along with other Ukrainians, he had first welcomed the 1941 Nazi invasion as a liberation, and even 2 years later, blessed the formation of a Ukrainian SS brigade. I can assure you of one thing: we are not going to unravel these contradictions right now. And in any case, we have another contradiction to deal with before I end. Here is my cousin Yehuda, showing me the flag on his sitting room wall. It's a handmade flag of Israel, sewn by my uncle Baruch, my father's brother, in internment camp in Italy 6 years before the State of Israel was founded. The flag was a constant companion on all his military campaigns, and on it he inscribed a record of all his military engagements, from anti-Nazi partisan warfare in Italy to the 1967 Six-Day War in the Middle East. The one time that I discussed Israel and Palestine with Baruch was back in 1973, when I was covering the Yom Kippur War for British television. I visited him in Jerusalem, exchanged news, and he asked my opinion of the situation. I shared what was, at that time, a fairly conventional British view, that after the humiliation suffered by the Arabs in the 1967 Six-Day War, this new war, which had seen both Israeli and Arab successes, had restored Arab pride. At last, the circumstances for a negotiated peace deal were more promising. Israel could exchange lands conquered in 1967 for peace with the Arab states. Baruch was outraged. Israel would never give up conquered lands. If I could not understand why I should visit Yad Vashem, Israel's Holocaust Museum. Well, now it was 2010, and I was again filming, this time for Welsh television, in Israel and Palestine. Baruch had not long passed away, and I visited his son. The flag on his living room wall looked like it could tell a story.
So, as you can see there, it was sewed together in 1942. That's what you can see. Italy, it's with the Hebrew thing, 1942. And after we escaped from that concentration camp, he joined together to the British Brigade 468 because he was part of the Jewish brigade. He has the right to go, so he made Aliyah to Israel. The first place where he joined the Mammoth, which was the foundation of the Israel forces. It was in 1945, and later on, preparing for independence, it was 1948. Yes. And he was part of the 8th Brigade from the Mammoth. Yep. And what you mentioned before, that he took part of the foundation of the Israel intelligence in the Israel Air Force 121. 121. Yes. 121. Yes. During the Six-Day War, where they took the Sinai Desert and so on and so. So it's all that. Yeah. Where this flag was in use.
Well, Baruch really did fill his flag.
One second.
The fog of war. Baruch's flag really did fill up with clues to his military history. After much research and cross-referencing, the story became clear, and nowhere more certain than on the 12th of May 1948. On that day, 2 days before British Palestine became Israel, my uncle's Palmach Brigade conquered and cleared Borer. You'll see it there in the centre right of the map. And neighbouring Najd, Simsin, Bulekat, and Kalkava. All available brigade fighters, many of them Holocaust survivors, like my uncle, occupied Borer. Brigade fighters killed villagers, executed dozens of army-age males, raped and murdered a teenage girl. The Jewish-controlled road to Gaza filled with fleeing Palestinians. Soon, Beit Timah and Hajj were conquered. 20 villagers killed, survivors expelled to Gaza. From Kaukava in the north to Hajj in the south, Palestinian expulsion in this Gaza region was complete under British rule. Google Maps shows Borer now, scrub, surrounded by the fields of Kibbutz Bro Chayil, founded just before Borer's destruction. Today the expellees and their descendants live in Gaza. The answer to my question, does Israel's occupation of Palestine have to concern me as a historian of my family, is hanging on my cousin's wall. And here we are now on the viewing platform at Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem. Yad Vashem is the only place in the world where my grandfather, Israel Gold, is commemorated. The dark underground galleries record the unspeakable history of Nazi destruction of a people. You walk your way through the underground galleries, steadily upwards until you suddenly break out into the dazzling sunlight of the Judean hills. These young men are new recruits to the IDF, the Israeli army, and they are here as part of their induction to military service, to learn the lesson that my uncle Baruch instructed me to learn back in 1973. As they look out, they see the trees of the land they are to defend. Under the trees are the ruins of the Palestinian village of Deir Yassin, destroyed in April 1948, the scene of the only massacre of Palestinians for which Israel has ever apologized. That massacre led to mass panic and flight throughout Palestine. Those who fled are by law not permitted to return. These soldiers look out at the view, they see the trees, they see the land, but they do not see the ruins. And that is why I'm making this story, Keys, a troubled inheritance.
How are relations with the Arabs? Try getting along in peace and friendship. It's likely to be important. It would be fine to communicate and to live in peace together with this similar race of people in future.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. That was quite a roller coaster, wasn't it? I remember as a child, I once was born and brought up in a rural town in Leicestershire, and I complained to my mother, a very forthright Yorkshire woman, that nothing ever really happened and it was a bit boring. And she said, well, dear, that's just how you want it. And of course, 8 years old, I didn't really believe her. But having heard that story, I think she might have been right. I admit this some decades later. Does anybody have any questions or any comments that they would like Mike to answer? Oh, yes, the lady in blue. You can take your mask off. I might have to repeat your question for the audience online.
It's not a very deep question, I don't think, but I'm just interested to know, why did you start at the age of 50 to undertake this mammoth journey? What was your sort of inspiration, or what sparked it?
The question is, why did Mike start at the age of 50, and what was his inspiration and what sparked it?
Should I take the question as it comes? That's actually brilliant, that question, because obviously I'm a journalist, so I'm used to asking questions about troublesome places and times. So why wasn't I, engaged sooner? It's partly for the same reason as you describe your Yorkshire childhood. We take our childhoods for granted. We take our parents' stories for granted. It's like the weather, wherever you grow up, that's normal, and anywhere else it's strange. So I grew up with the stories, some of them, which I've shared this evening, being normality. And so in a sense, they didn't trigger questions until my own life took, slightly different directions. And I began to, ask maybe questions that were more troublesome. There is a very specific reason, though, and maybe I'll just expand on that a bit. The one part of my mother's lost inheritance that wasn't actually lost was her family home in Leipzig. You saw a brief photograph of it at the beginning in the snow. That photograph was actually taken just a couple of days after I first saw it in 1991, shortly after the Berlin Wall opened and it was possible to go to East Germany. And after having struggled all her life for any kind of restitution, as you heard, it was a pretty thankless task, suddenly there was a piece of real estate which was hers, she should have it back, and I went to Leipzig to get it back. The first several episodes of my documentary series describes that was anything but a straightforward business, and I'm not going to give any spoilers away, but I will give one spoiler away, which comes right back to your question. This photo isn't any old key. It's the key of my mother's house in Leipzig, which was plundered by the Nazi Dippmann in 1943, and then plundered again by East Germany in 1951. And you'll see on the shaft of the key the M, Does anybody know, I wonder, what that M stands for? It's Messe. It's the Leipziger Messe. That is the logo of what put Leipzig on the world map. So that really identifies that key in place and time. When I finally succeeded to recover my mother's house after many years in a united Germany, I thought, my mother's never going to go there. She's very old. What should I do? I can't, give her anything except some sense of satisfaction. I know I'll take the keys of the house and I'll give them to her, which I did. And she was appalled. She was perhaps even more dismayed after receiving the keys than before. Why? So obvious, got the keys of a house back that she's never going to see, that were the home of a family that she will never, ever have. And so that immediately told me, if there's one thing I have to do, it's go and recover the story of the family. Does that answer your... Yeah.
Any other questions? Looking around the room. Are there any questions on Zoom?
No,
not yet.
I've got a few points just to quickly...
Yes, Mike has some questions. No, some points.
Well, but before we all go for a well-earned drink, I would very much just like to share a list of some of the most important credits for this production. I mean, one thing you'll all know is that it has taken a lot of time and a lot of people to bring this story into the shape that you now hear it, and it will take more yet. In a way, it's invidious to name any names, but I will anyway. I mean, firstly, I really have to thank Asher, who's retired to the left there, for really pulling off the feat of us having something to see as well as hear this evening. I mean, well done, Asher. I'm very, very much in with it. What you haven't heard much of this evening is the work of my sound editor, a Bath man, Zach Ware, who runs a studio which has many jobs on the go, and mine is one amongst many, but one that he puts a particular edge of excellence and perception into. Thank you, Zach. On the front row, Christine Willison, my drama director, as well as many other roles, but she, as an experienced director of stage, has made it possible for me, a journalist, to start producing moments of drama, which are all, of course, factually based. The one thing that I will insist is that no words that you hear dramatized have been made up. They are all authentic. They are all sourced, traceable, and demonstrable. My media advisor, who can't be here this evening, James Stewart, keeps me in touch with the real world of broadcast media. The music you heard is the brilliant work of my colleague, pianist and composer in the Netherlands, Micha Wink, and more names than I can mention, but the voices of Bath, who I think have put themselves alongside the voices of history indistinguishably. I'm amazed how voices of the past and the present have collaborated to bring this story into focus. Thank you all.
Wow, thank you, and for bringing the stunningly interesting story to life, and or back to life, really. I'd just like to add my thanks, because Philippa Sondheimer has done an incredible amount of background work, and thank you all for attending, and the people on Zoom. I feel a bit disembodied wherever you are. I don't know where to look. Thank you for attending, and yeah, thank you for coming.